Hi everybody, thank you so much for having me today. I'll just have my presentation on the screen in one moment as the computer fires up. And I want to offer a special thank you to Ruth for extending the invite. As she mentioned, we've met a few times at different events. I do work here in this area as I organize for forest and watershed health throughout the Coast Range. There we go. So yeah, I work for Oregon Wild, as mentioned, and this is a little bit about Oregon Wild, and I'm going to switch back and forth today between talking about myself, my work, my specific work, as well as Oregon Wild's larger work. And to do some honor to the venue here, I've worked in a little bit of a discussion about faith and the environment, and tried to frame some conversation around the Unitarian covenants, the list here, which is really fantastic, and it's really actually very enjoyable to read and consider from the same kind of angle and lens that me and a lot of my colleagues look at our work through, which is to not just look at the tree or the forest that we need to save, but to look at the dignity of a place, to look at the lens of justice and equity when we discuss environmental impacts. The things that we talk about in my work and in my field, one of the things that's long gone undiscussed is how differently different communities of people are impacted by environmental degradation, by how differently and how unequitably people access some of our most splendid places. And then, of course, world goals and communities and democratic processes are a huge part of our work. An awful lot of our work is actually about getting people involved in democratic processes on any level that it's available to them. And so it was really actually a very interesting process for me to go through kind of an exercise of looking at my typical presentations and then looking at this lens of these principles and seeing that not much needed to change, that not much needed to shift. I very often have conversations or meetings or get-togethers with communities of faith, of various faiths I work with. But this is the first time that I'm presenting in this kind of setting in a place of worship. So thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it. So Oregon Wild's mission is here for you to read, with a lovely picture of some of the public lands and waters that we work to defend. And Oregon Wild works to protect and restore Oregon's wildlands, wildlife, and waters as an enduring legacy for all Oregonians. I'd like to mention that we've recently been discussing this statement and if it really actually accurately represents the work that we do. For one thing, we want to protect this legacy for people far beyond Oregonians. We want to protect this legacy for people who are not currently Oregonians, for people who live here in Oregon and aren't treated or accepted as Oregonians, for people who want to visit our natural places from elsewhere, and then, of course, for everyone. So one of the ways we're looking at changing this statement for the future is to protect this enduring legacy for future generations. And just leave it there. Not future generations of people, not my descendants, not your descendants, for all future generations, for future generations of forests, for future generations of salmon, and then for future generations of all people who may need to call this place home in the future, even if they don't now. Guess I killed my battery, so I won't use the clicker. So this is me, I'm Jason Gonzales. I want to put this contact information up there first and foremost and leave it up for a minute, mostly because I forgot my bag of paperwork to distribute amongst you, which means you will not take home a pile of papers today. I promise they would have been printed on recycled paper. But they won't be coming with you, and looking at how things lay out here on the screen, I apologize, it does look like we'll have some cutting off at the corners, so if there's anything that I need to explain, looking at how this actually measures up, there's some quotes that I may have to read for you, and you may be missing some words along the right side edge there. And that just happens, all these screens read differently. But as we get into this discussion here, I want to tell you a little bit about myself This is me, this is where I live in the background there. This is my backyard where I'm raising my children, where I'm raising my family, where we go for our moments of peace, where we go to clear our minds. This, I would say, is our cathedral. And I think it's an appropriate description for a family that's not a particular part of any given faith, but that absolutely appreciates the depth and spirituality of connections to nature. And again, I would really love for you to take down my contact information if you think you may have any interest in discussing any of this further or contacting me in the future. And I apologize that you won't be leaving with that contact information in your hand. So this is a little farther into my backyard, and it is a way that I can tell you about why I do the work that I do. Groups like Oregon Wild and conservation organizers and activists that I work with, we're often called tree huggers, or we're out there to save a tree, right, or to save this tree, and very often it's made about the tree, or made about the spotted owl, or made about the salmon. And the thing that connects all of that is the water. And mostly what I work on is water. I'm the Forest and Watershed Campaign organizer, and what I actually am doing, what that doesn't tell you, is that what I'm actually doing is working to reform Oregon's state forest policy. Most of the work that Oregon Wild does is framed around federal policy, whether that's protecting national forests, our 45-year history of the heart of the work we do being actually implementing wilderness designations. But what I work on is state forest policy, which has jurisdiction over about half of Oregon's forest land. And that state forest policy is called the Oregon Forest Practices Act. And it's the weakest forest policy in the region of all of our neighboring states in this part of the world. And the reason that I like to tell you a little bit about why the work that I do matters to me on a personal level is explained really clearly in these pictures. That's my drinking water. You can see on the picture on the left, the forest above. Of course, a picture doesn't do it justice, but those trees are much larger around than me. That is the forest that provides my family with life. That is the forest that provided previous generations with life. And it's also the forest that provides all the critters that live in the stream downstream from us with life. Without that forest and without that stream, things don't live. And that matters a lot to me, because that forest above us that we're looking at that provides my drinking water is actually completely unprotected from clear-cut logging of every tree you can see in this picture under Oregon's law. Those big trees that are in the stream, like the one that's pictured on the right, it's literally a large tree in a stream, under our current forest management policies, could be clear-cut any day. It's actually somewhat on the chopping block sometime in the next few years, we believe. And so what I do is actually work with communities of people all over Oregon who have the same situation. When you don't live in Florence or in Eugene or in a place that has a municipal water system, especially if you live in the Oregon Coast Range, there's a very good chance that you have a drinking water setup like mine. And a lot of people who don't live out in the woods don't actually realize that. Some of my neighbors are on well water. Some of the people in communities that I work in are on well water. But a lot of us, in some communities, the vast majority of us, including in my own community, the vast majority of us, actually get our water from these small surface level streams. Streams that come from forests, and if we're lucky, that come from protected forests like the Siuslaw National Forest, or other places throughout the Coast Range that are strongly protected. But some of us, those forests are owned by private corporations, and they're regulated under state forest policy, which doesn't protect the water. Now, if you go back downstream a few hundred yards to the larger stream that's almost as big across as this room and has salmon in it for part of the year, you'll find a small amount of protections, about a half to a third of the level of protections that federal lands get. But up here in the streams that we actually get our drinking water from, there's none. Streams like this, according to Oregon State University researchers, make up about 2/3 of our stream network in Oregon. That means about 2/3 of our stream network in Oregon, which could look like this, or could look like tree farms, or could look like other diverse forests, but they're not protected because they're not big enough to be protected. Those percentages in a given watershed can go as high as 85%, but average over the state, it's about 74% of the watershed. So to be a little bit generous in that everyone disagrees about the number, I say 2/3. It's really actually 3/4 or more under some research, but I say 2/3. So this is our forest, this is where we live, this is where I work. And this is where I take people to learn. We take people into forests that look like this on a regular basis, and it's where we spend a lot of our time. But to give you a little more insight into what that really means for me, I'll show you a very different picture. This is also my home. This is also my forest. We mill. We cut down trees pretty regularly. I heat my home with wood. My home's made out of logs. I use the same paper products as everybody else in the state. I try to buy recycled. It's not always an option. But we actually are big believers in wood products. This isn't my mill. I don't own the property, but I'm very close with the landlord. We work on environmental activism together, and I help run this. I help manage this forest, and I help when I can with things like milling and building. When I need to build something in my yard, if I want to build a new shed to cover firewood, we go out and we cut down trees, we run them through the mill, and we build stuff. But I want to make an important distinction from some things that I've been talking about. The forest behind the mill there is where we get our logs. Not only do we get our own logs from that forest, but we've actually sent from the forest, you can see in this picture and more later, truckloads of forest products, of logs, to mills before. And you can see what's left behind. We have a healthy forest here. There's different aged trees. There's forage on the ground for animals. There's tall old trees that are growing into old growth. And we will continue thinning in there. We will continue planting, but we never clear cut. We always protect the water, and we don't use widespread application of any kind of herbicides or other chemicals on the property. In fact, we don't use any herbicides or chemicals on the property. And this is what we're able to leave behind. Things like this. This is a logged forest. This is a working forest. Very often in Oregon, we're shown pictures of working forests that are tree farms or clear cuts. And I like to draw a distinction there. Those are tree farms or clear cuts. This is a forest. It's a working forest. It hasn't been removed from being a forest at any point in its history. There's always been trees there, even when it was logged 50 years ago. Fortunately, this piece had some large trees left behind. And so on our property, we have old growth. On our property, we have drinking water streams. On our property, we have many endangered species like marbled murrelets, northern spotted owls, multiple species of salmon that are threatened or endangered or almost there. And we have working forests and mill products. Those things are compatible when you take a view of protecting the watershed and growing the ecosystem. And in my mind, there's nothing that can bring me closer to a spirituality than something like this. This is a tree in my backyard. It's one of the bigger trees that we have on the property. And we like to throw this picture in there because despite my occasional attempt at a little bit of defensiveness, we are tree huggers. I have a shirt that I like to wear in some communities where I might be taken a little bit badly. That it has a picture of a stump and it says, "Don't worry, I hugged it first." Because I am a tree hugger, and I am an environmentalist, and I am rather radical in my beliefs that these places should and can exist for their own sake, and that we depend on them for our life. But, like I've been saying, we also recognize that we live in Oregon. I don't want people to think, ever, that we're attacking them for the mere fact that they cut down trees. That we're criticizing people for being in a line of work in rural Oregon that relies on them killing trees every day. Because most of the people that I work with who are out here fighting for these forests do the same. Many of us do. What we don't want to leave behind is this. This is a newly acquired property next door to the property that I've been showing you. That is what the logging industry refers to as a working forest. This is what I call a tree farm. You can see the difference between the way some forests are managed and the industrial status quo. We have no life underneath at the ground level. We have no forage for wildlife. We have small dead branches so close together they're touching, making a tinderbox when fire season comes that we worry about every year as we work to restore healthy characteristics to these forests. Science from OSU and elsewhere actually tells us that plantations such as this burn much more severely than our other native forests that we care about a lot. And you can kind of see why on a picture like this. So fortunately, we've been able, our landlord who we work with has been able to acquire properties like this so that not only can we protect the places that he has and already has, but so that we can actually grow the healthy forest around us as much as possible, and that we can work on places like this to re-diversify them, to get those ground level forest understories growing again, to make it so there's more than one tree growing here, to protect the water. It all comes down to the water. So in preparing to speak with this group today, I thought it was really interesting to look a little bit more into Unitarian Universalist fellowship. Something I'm fairly familiar with as a progressive in a place like Oregon, and a lot of the communities that I work with, like I said, are from different communities of faith. Many of those are from the Methodist faith. A lot of folks in the Methodist faith in Eugene work with groups, different activist and climate change groups that I work with. But I started to think, what about all the other faiths? What does everybody out there in these different churches and spiritualities think about the kind of work that I care about so much? And of course, I found that most of them seem to be in agreement that we depend on the world around us for life, and that spirituality and environmentalism should have a lot to do with each other. I found that in the Bible, we have a lot of discussion about the earth, about the animals, about our responsibility to tend there, about our responsibility to care. I found that in the Quran, we had almost identical language that we saw in other faiths. I found that in Judaism, we want to respect not only the fate of man, but the fate of beast, because they have one fate. If we kill the ecosystems that beasts rely on, we kill the ecosystems that we rely on. And then, of course, found beautiful language from the Dalai Lama, and some really interesting various things from Hinduism that I was really excited to look at. And so I thought this was really appropriate for a group such as this that recognizes many different faiths, that doesn't come together under one specific sacred text, that discusses the interconnectedness of all these things. Because from the lens that I apply to everything that I do and look at, the lens of the water, the lens of the wildlife, and the lens of the forests that store carbon to stabilize our climate and provide us with drinking water and breathing air, it actually seemed that every sacred text I could find had significant language devoted to the protection of wildlife and the honoring of the creation. In a lot of the work that I do, I work very closely with different tribes. Not always in this area, where we are actually today on the historic land of the Sayusla tribe, who of course was displaced by colonialism in the last century. You can see the area that we're in here on the map. It's actually, I'm looking at this now on this size screen, and I suppose it's not incredibly clear, but you all know the coast, and I bet you can spot yourselves on there. And that shows you the territory of the Sayusla tribe, which actually now shares a status with other neighboring tribes because of what's been done to them over the past few hundred years, and is now part of the Kus Loram Kwa and Sayusla Confederated tribes over a large shared area with very little actual land holdings. I'm excited to say that in a lot of the federal lands work that Oregon Wild does, we actually do work really closely with these tribes, as well as our federal agencies in the management of the Sayusla National Forest. But of course, when it comes to faith and spirituality, when it comes to the idea that the forests and waters that surround us provide us life, I've never found a faith, a belief system, or a spirituality that takes that more to heart than the various tribes that I work with from this region. I've had children explain to me that we don't need to protect the fish to serve us. We need to protect salmon because those are our ancestors. Because we believe in these things. Because these animals, they take our spirituality to the ocean and they bring us back nutrients to feed us and to grow our forest every year. Because I hear stories of the historical importance of the wildlife, of the interconnectedness, of there being no line between us and the natural world around us. And so I'm always very, very proud when I'm able to work on things like the No LNG pipeline campaign, which is really relevant to the Central Coast, where hundreds of miles of river and forest ecosystems are under threat, and Native people from the Klamath tribes all the way up to the Coos Bay area are joining together to fight such devastating projects. And I find that so often the conversation really revolves around the salmon. One of the greatest things about where I live is that we have a salmon stream, and that every fall the salmon come back. And I can honestly say that aside from watching my kids hug trees, there's probably no closer thing that I have to some kind of spiritual epiphany or experience than every year when we see those salmon come back for the first time. There's nothing that helps me understand the struggle of life and the interconnectedness of all of it more than seeing those salmon return every year, those salmon that feed us, that feed our forests, and that feed our rivers. The interdependentness of all of that always strikes me when I see those first salmon, who've some swum in my yard only about 45 miles upstream, but in other parts of the region might swim 900, 950,000 miles upstream, around dams, over waterfalls, to get back to where they belong. And I find nothing more inspiring than that. And I don't feel like we can talk about spirituality and faith in the environment without honoring what the tribes here did for time immemorial, without causing the devastation that we're fighting and resisting today. So for me, the question becomes, in discussing spirituality and the environment, are we caring for the creation? I find the creation to be the common thread and language amongst many of the faiths that I work with. Very often that's what I talk about, the environment or the earth, and the person sitting across from me will be talking about the creation. That makes me a little uncomfortable when I talk about it. That's not a normal part of my language when I'm not really talking about things from a faith perspective. But so many of the people that I work with discuss the creation, honoring the creation, caring for the creation, whether those are tribal folks or Methodists on the North Coast. I always hear people talk about honoring the creation. And so when I'm working with communities of faith, that's my question. Are we caring for the creation? What can we do to honor the creation? This is a satellite imagery time lapse of the North Coast of Oregon. This is basically southwest Clatsop County, kind of getting down into Tillamook County. And I know it's a little hard to see, but at this scale, every one of those little brown dots that's popping up is a clear cut. And I want you to take note on the top left-hand corner. If you can see those yellow numbers, right about now, this will flip over, and it starts in the year 2000 right now. This is just the last 15 years. This isn't the bad old days. This isn't the ancient past. This is the way logging is done in Oregon under our current regulatory structure. I do not have any way of looking at this and arguing that we are honoring the creation. This is just a little bit further south to show a specific case, the case of Jetty Creek, which you can see the Nehalem River is coming into the ocean on the northern end with a large bar. And you can see in just the last 15 years, almost 90% of this drinking watershed was clear cut. No laws were broken in these processes, I like to make that clear. This is drinking water for an entire population of people. There's just a couple hundred people there. They had to spend $1.5 million installing a new drinking water system after this just to have water to drink. During the winter, they still have to buy bottled water very often because of the runoff from those clear cuts. A holy place on the central coast of Oregon to tribal folks is the Siletz River and the Siletz Gorge. There's actually an awful lot of interesting work going on there and history there with the native people. And this shows what we've been doing again. This actually goes back to 1984, it's just not the last 15 years. But I left the whole cycle up there because you can see that it's multiple cycles that's happened of this. And what we find is after multiple cycles, we're not able to grow trees as well. Meaning that where we used to cut down trees at anywhere from 60 to 100 years old, now we cut them down every 30 to 40 years and implant an even weaker tree species than we had before. And this is what we're doing there. Up close, some pictures from my backyard again. This is in Western Lane County, and this is what these things look like up close. And of course, they're sprayed immediately for 4 years after that with herbicides from helicopters. An example of how we don't protect the water. This is a picture taken in Douglas County of a stream that is completely clear-cut, the entire watershed above it. And again, this is the North Coast. This is a stream that's about 10 feet wide. It's not a tiny stream. It's not just a little trickle of water. And it has zero protections from clear-cut logging, largely because there's a waterfall just downstream from me, meaning that only certain species of fish live in this portion of the stream, and it receives no protections. This is actually one of the more heinous clear-cuts over a stream that I've been able to find. And then, of course, this is just an example of one area. I could show you these for the whole coast. This is the Coos Bay area up on the top left, and the bottom right is the Coquille area. This is aerial herbicide applications onto those clear cuts for just 1 year. Every one of those little red dots or those little purple dots. You can see hundreds of clear cuts being sprayed with herbicides from the air in just 1 year in these areas. Those herbicides are products that are designed to kill. There's no argument around that. We can agree or disagree on how much they should or could be used, but there's no debate over whether or not they are designed to kill. And of course, we also do a lot of work other than just the clear-cut work that I do, but to protect Oregon's most majestic places. This is just a little bit south of here in the proposed Devil's Staircase Wilderness, an area that we're working to gain permanent protections to protect places that are beautiful like this, that are cathedral-like this. Some of the creation's most incredible things, I think, we find out in the wildest places. This is some bear grass flowers up in the Cascade Crest. Some butterflies on some, oh man, I'm freezing on the name of this flower. I knew it last night when I reviewed the presentation. So I didn't put it in the notes. But this is what we find out in the places that we're working to protect. Places like the Elliott State Forest, where we can see the splendor of the creation. And this is where I believe we have so much of a shared value set and mission in honoring the world. And so I want to tell you just really briefly a little bit about what we do at Oregon Wild to protect these places. And that's basically community organizing. It's not so different than what we might do as a church. We get out there and meet people in the community. We talk about the values that we share, and we work together to bring about a better future. So I work with communities all up and down the Oregon coast, starting at about Coos Bay and going all the way up to Astoria. This is an informational event with folks from the Rockaway Citizens for Watershed Protection, informing folks at Oswald West State Park, that are mostly from Portland, that there's clear cutting and poisoning of the streams that they're planning and going on. This is a group of folks from around the coast that came together with me in Portland to bring that same message to Portland. And so we were doing kind of a more traditional protest of shaking signs outside of a timber industry convention. We brought a Lorax in, as you can see. That was a lot of fun. That Lorax actually lives just up the coast here in Waldport. And several folks from the coast came and joined us for that. We do educational events where we teach people how to monitor the clear cutting and aerial spray that goes on. This is me giving a presentation up in Newport, and so we not only do community organizing where we're out in the streets, but we are in classrooms doing educational events. We're in breweries doing presentations like this one that are a little bit more social and fun in the evening hours, where we're able to get together with, this is a picture I took in Astoria. Again, you can see my kids are in a lot of these pictures. In this one, I didn't know till I saw the picture that one of my friends had given her a phone to play with, which I never do. But this is just a brewery. There's about 60 people that came out to a science pub, and we got to talk to them about all this and meet all these folks and get them involved and work to a better future. And then, of course, we try to do things that are fun, like hikes. This is one of the biggest trees in the country that is in a state park surrounded by clear cuts up in the Canton Beach region that we took a couple of years ago. And we try to do fun social things like that. Again, we do these presentations in breweries. And then, of course, we're always doing things like email campaigns where we can help you connect to your local elected officials, where you can work with us to advocate for the things that we care about. But most importantly, what we try to do is get people thinking about these issues and caring about these issues, because we find, especially in Oregon, there's a widespread belief that we took care of our forestry issues 20 years ago. And what I try to convey to people is that that's not the case. Those glorious places that I showed you in these pictures that are still beautiful and incredible are places that are currently unprotected. They could be logged, they could be developed in some cases, depending on the picture. Those clear-cutting pictures that I showed you are under the current regulatory system, meaning that that is ongoing. One of the other things that we do in our widespread education is just trying to get people talking about the fact that it's happening, like I said. And this is how the kind of thing that we do with that. We try to use a little bit of humor. This is actually an image that we had driving around Portland for 2 months on the side of an X train. So this was 80 feet long and 10 feet tall. Oh. And it sends people to www.clearcutoregon.com, where we have information about all of our private lands campaign work that we do out here on the coast, as well as ways for people to take action. And then, of course, our main website, www.oregonwild.org, is where you can get more information about all of our various campaigns. One of the things that I didn't really want to spend the time to get into today is our wildlife work. But you can find so much information there. You could also, actually, Ruth, if you wouldn't mind starting to pass around that yellow pad for me. You could also just get signed up with us on an email list. I actually do a lot of events here in this region. Like I said, I work from Coos Bay to Astoria, so I'm regularly in Florence, in Yahats, and in this general area, doing much more in-depth presentations or workshops than this. And so I encourage you to go and check out our websites and look at more of our information. The yellow pad will come around for me to get your email address if you're interested in staying in touch. If you put your zip code, I won't bug you about things we're doing in Portland or Eastern Oregon. If you don't put your zip code, it may be a little less targeted. But so I'm not going to leave you with a pretty image today because I showed a few, and I like to leave people with this one because it has the website. And so I just want to say thank you very much for having me today. I know that my news isn't the most joyous and there's a lot of concerns here, but it is kind of the reality of what we face every day in the Oregon Coast Range as people. And then to remind you that as we've learned so much from Indigenous people in recent years, that water is life. Yes. And what we're all working for is a better life, for future life, and for life itself. And that our efforts to protect forests and waters are the same as our efforts to protect ourselves. So thank you very much for having me, and I look forward to talking to you more.